Well, here we are to finish up the discussion that we were having last time. That has to do with the topics that are on your outline from with the outline that bears the title "From Suez to Cuba, 1957 to 1963." So last time we were talking about let's see, a whole string of things: the world fallout from the events of 1956 and then the attempts by the United States to put together an alliance system in the Middle East, the instability of Middle East politics. We'll take that up again when we talk about Israel's attack on its neighbors in 1967. That's going to change everything in the Middle East. And then we talked about Khrushchev and the anti-party group, the challenge to his rule in 1957, and how Khrushchev managed to overcome this challenge, beat off Molotov and his friends, Mayenkov and Kaganovich, and how eventually Khrushchev got what looked like complete control of things, but it was not at all a complete control of things. In fact, the argument that we made last time was that collective leadership more or less came to the fore, that it was established pretty much in the Soviet system, and the person who was directing it was not Khrushchev at all. It was Mikhail Suslov, about whom we'll say quite a good deal as we pursue this topic further. Not today, though. I think next time, or maybe the time after, we'll get around to talking about Suslov in 1964, because he's going to organize a grouping in the party, and in fact, it'll be a central committee vote. It'll be 300 members, of the party voting. What would that be comparable to? Our House of Representatives, maybe. Very roughly speaking. Bear in mind, of course, that these people are not elected; they're appointed naturally. But at any rate, they will overthrow Khrushchev himself in 1964. That gives you an indication about what's happening in the Soviet system, how it isn't exactly the same system. In fact, it's quite a bit different, dramatically different, you'd have to say, from the system that they inherited from Stalin. Then we took up Khrushchev's relationship with Mao, and we made the argument that it had to do with nuclear weapons, and well, at any rate, that the difficulties that came up between the Soviet Union and Communist China only came up in 1959 or 1960 or so. And this is about the time when Khrushchev made the decision not to give the Chinese nuclear weapons. And then we kicked around this idea that appears in the Chinese literature in the 1960s, in Chinese press in the 1960s, looking back on the relations between Soviet Union and China. They say that the Soviets decided to give them nuclear weapons in 57 and decided against giving them nuclear weapons in 59. And they accused Khrushchev of making a deal with the United States, whereby the United States would not give nuclear weapons to Konrad Adenauer's Germany in return for the Soviet Union refusing to give nuclear weapons to the Chinese. But that Khrushchev tells us in his memoirs, though, that they had given them almost everything you need to build a bomb. They'd sent a lot of technicians there, a lot of equipment. They had even built a bomb prototype for the Chinese. So this was a decision that apparently got reversed in a hurry because of things that happened in 1958, 1959. So we're tempted to think it's the crisis over Quemoy and Matsu in 1958. Maybe it's the US IRBM strategy and the way the Chinese related to that, and various fears that some kind of nuclear war would break out perhaps caused this reconsideration on the part of Khrushchev, or perhaps it was the doing of the United States. Perhaps it was the United States' timely consideration of an offer to the Germans to give them nuclear weapons. Perhaps that's what did the trick. We don't know all about this, and we'll have to learn about it when the documents are finally published, but they have not been. So we have to go basically on the way the Chinese tell the story, at least up to this up to this point. So at any rate, we had reached this fascinating tale last time, and then we're starting to talk about a big squawk, big difficulties between China and the Soviet Union. It's going to be a big theme in our course from this point on. It may even be perhaps center stage in our considerations from this point on. So this is where it all starts. Well, while we were talking about those things, though, we had neglected to take it to the extent of talking about the developments in geopolitics that accompany this period, the decolonization of Africa. And so let's talk about those last themes in this session and see if we can finish up with these topics that are on your outline. And let's see, they include the decolonization of Africa, the Cuban Revolution, and the confrontations between Kennedy and Khrushchev, what you might call the diplomatic crisis of 61-2, and John Kennedy's great towering victory over Khrushchev in this what looked to be a kind of climax of the Cold War. So the issue then is the wave of independence movements that swept over the Third World, and the special dramatic effect that the movements in Africa had on a world scale. But we're interested in it because it had a huge effect in the United States. It lit up a movement that was already underway, of course, a long-running struggle for civil rights in the United States on the part of black people struggling against Jim Crow. It gave a special kind of flavor to the radicalism of this struggle, a special influence over black leaders, black students in the United States, and black leaders of the civil rights movement who are well known to us, people like Martin Luther King, Stokely Carmichael, H. Rap Brown, Huey Newton, Bobby Seale, and others. So let's talk about that, African independence then, and how that was shaping up and how that looked to the rest of the world. Remember that the Suez events had in effect changed the whole structure of colonial relationships. These are mostly relationships of the former British colonies, French colonies, and we have to include to some degree the Spanish colonies and the Belgians in the Congo, and lastly, I suppose we have to include the Portuguese. So this thing's going to be stretching on into the 70s, but it's major events. The major part of this movement comprises events that took shape in the 1960s in the wake of Suez, because Britain and France, as colonial powers, look very weak after Suez, and it looks like the moment for a anti-colonial jailbreak, and that's really what we see from this point on. So there's the map of Africa, the way it looked at the end of World War II, and as you see, we've got a number of countries there that still belong to the Europeans. You know, Belgian Congo, French, that whole French Quarter in the many countries in the Maghreb and in Central Africa and West Africa. And we have, of course, British possessions in the Rhodesias, the British are in Kenya and other places in Africa. And so we've got pretty much, how to put it, a very considerable colonial coloration to the map of Africa that we inherit from World War II. So World War II did not solve the problem, I'm trying to say in my crude way, that World War II did not solve the problem of colonialism by itself. After World War II, the colonial powers still were hanging on. And I think perhaps we have to pay more attention to Suez and trying to explain how colonialism collapsed. But at any rate, after Suez, there is this veritable colonial, anti-colonial jailbreak throughout Africa. And everybody starts looking at Africa in terms of what you might call informal empire rather than the old-fashioned colonial empire, that is to say, in terms of trade relationships, economic relationships, and as this map indicates, access to raw materials. So there's all kinds of important stuff in Africa. And Africa is a big place. And the idea that the West is going to completely forget about Africa just because it decolonizes, that's kind of unsophisticated, isn't it? There are going to be many interests by the same colonizing powers that will linger on even after they've given these countries their freedom, and those relationships are going to continue. But the struggle for freedom is something that takes up our interest at the end of the 50s and the beginning of the 60s. For example, it was very sensational in British East Africa, in Kenya, with the Mau Mau movement at the end of the 1950s. A very dramatic kind of rising of different tribes in Africa, the Kikuyu, for example, and other important tribes. 3 or 4 tribes pretty much run Kenya. And they made a big rising, formed a movement for land and freedom, and started to fight a guerrilla war, essentially, against the British. British made an attempt, kind of half-hearted attempt, to put it down. And then they decided they were going to have to exterminate these Mau Mau terrorists, or they would lose everything in Africa. So at the end of the 50s, you get this rather bitter civil war developing there. And it centered around a leader of African nationalist sentiment, and especially Kenyan independence sentiment by the name of Jomo Kenyatta, who had a terrific reputation in the West, especially among the black diaspora, and especially among black people in the United States. They all knew Jomo Kenyatta. And Jomo Kenyatta ended up in all of the media in the West. And he was depicted for the most part as a wild man who was leading the Mau Mau, and they were carrying out all these grisly acts of terror. And of course, really attempt by the media, I think, especially the case with the British media, and to some extent with the American media as well, to paint him out as a real a wild man with a hatchet, so to speak. But that was not Jomo Kenyatta. He was Oxford educated. He knew English, very familiar with British intellectuals, and his nationalism, of course, was of a very journalistic type. He was not a leader of the Mau Mau guerrilla activities, but he did emerge at the end of it as more or less the beneficiary of those activities, because he was a person who was turned to, who could form a state and who could make the Mau Mau happy. So he would have been less radical, I think, than some other leaders who might have come to the fore. But he was plenty radical, at least in terms of African independence. So he's a very, very popular figure, well known in the West, very charismatic. He loved to have fun with all of the tribal ceremonies that took place in the Kenyan tribes, and he loved to act like an African tribesman. Of course, he loved to be photographed in that way. And during this period, a lot of it came to be very trendy among intellectuals, among students in West Europe and Britain and the United States. There was a dance called the Watusi that everybody tried to do, was patterned on the movements of these magnificent, beautiful people, the Watusi, the giant Watusi people, who were very, very tall, some of them 7 feet tall people. Beautiful, graceful dancing that absolutely caught the fancy of the Western youth. And there was great admiration for things African that had a great deal to do with all of this enthusiasm for African nationalism. Kenyatta had supporters all over West Europe, all over Britain, all over the United States. And the British behaved rather badly, trying to put them down, trying to put the Mau Mau down. So there was a great deal of sympathy that gathered around the cause of Kenyan nationalism. And of course, that means African nationalism in general, as a result of these things. A big focus on the events in British East Africa. But not to say that the decision to make a deal with the Mau Mau and allow Jomo Kenyatta to come to power, not to say that it meant that in the British media that there would be any acceptance of black nationalism in Africa. There really wasn't. Um, you do see certain plays and novels, some films, where you see some sympathy indicated toward the Mau Mau, but mostly in films, they're presented as absolute savages of the worst sort, and who are going to terrorize, are going to leave gutted animals on your porch at night, going to frighten you and frighten the women and children, of the settler plantations, and so a lot of this was exploited in media, and you can still see these films that have this distinct coloration, very anti-Mau Mau, anti-African, and I must say British colonialist in sentiment. Great deal of that stuff appeared before American and British audiences in those days. But students in the United States and to some extent in other places in the Atlantic world, and they were learning more about some of these African leaders, and a lot of them had a great deal of charisma and attraction for some of the students, and especially the young black students. And this is the case with black universities in the south of the United States and also in the north as well. So these three figures were very important and started to loom up as very powerful, charismatic role models for black leadership in this black movement in Africa. Sékou Touré on the left of Guinea, a French colony. It's going to be independent. Sékou Touré is going to refuse to join the French Union, the French imitation that, as we were indicating last time, of the British Commonwealth. Sékou Touré will refuse to join it, and the French will tear up all of their possessions as they did in Indochina. They'll dig up their dead out of the graveyards, take everything home, take everything out, don't leave Sékou Touré with anything in Guinea. And really, this is the only important country that refused to join the French Union. So it was a great insult. De Gaulle took it as a terrible insult. French generally took it as a terrible insult. In the middle is Kwame Nkrumah. So he was educated in the United States, went to, University of Pittsburgh, if I'm not wrong, or was it Temple? I'm maybe missing on his university, but anyway, he's educated in the United States, knew a lot of people in the United States, and was regarded very highly by U.S. black political and cultural religious leaders. And at the end, Modibo Keita of Mali, who completes the trio. So these three people, Sékou Touré, Kwame Nkrumah, Modibo Keita, they were going to bring together some kind of a union among their countries, which don't amount to much. They're small countries. But eventually, the idea was that they were going to be the seed around which an organization of African unity would develop, and a real African national development would occur. Now, that has all kinds of portents for the thinking of people in the West, especially colonialists and ex-colonialists. Remember how they felt about Nasser's notions of uniting all the Arab countries. Well, these ideas are similar. Some sort of vague conception of some kind of African unity. I mean, we don't know if it could be an African state or super state, United States of Africa. There's always the example of the United States for a country that was not very united through most of its history. The states all fighting with each other and having every kind of difference, having to settle things in a very bloody civil war and all the rest of that just to maintain their unity. But that this serves as a kind of a model for African nationalism, for conceptions of African unity, and things of that sort. Did I say African nationalism? I meant Arab nationalism, but also for African unity ideas as well. So at any rate, they got to be well known among black students in the United States. They knew all about the Mau Mau. They knew about Jomo Kenyatta. They knew about the giant Watusi. They heard all sorts of wonderful things about Nkrumah and Touré and all of these notions of African unity. And then they witnessed the drama that broke out in 1960 in the Congo with enormous interest. It's centered around the figure of Patrice Lumumba. So Lumumba was trying to put the Congo together, and on the basis of some kind of unity of the existing state, he wanted to inherit the entire state. But you know that there's a tendency when countries decolonize for the decolonizing power to carry out a partition of the country as sort of the last act before the colonizer leaves. You know, as the British did with India, breaking it up and forming a separate state out of Pakistan. And the Belgians and the French wanted to do something similar with the Congo, did not want to hand it over to the African nationalists and to a person like Patrice Lumumba, although he's certainly not a wild man, and I must say very much a much more ordinary third world intellectual than a person like Jomo Kenyatta even. So not the kind of person you would normally have feared, except the logic is that if there's going to be a partition, a person like this is going to resist the partition, start looking around for weapons. Who's going to give him weapons? Well, it'd be nice if the colonizers would give him weapons and set him up in office. Maybe they don't see the future of the country, the future of the Congo the same way. And so who is there to ask for weapons? Well, Nasser demonstrated that you could ask the Soviet bloc, and they'll give you weapons to help you to defy the imperialists. So that whole logic started to play out in the Congo, and Lumumba started to go in the direction of a negotiation with the Soviets to get some weapons in order to solidify his state. Think of this in terms of the analogy of the United States, the way it existed right after the 7-year war, long drawn-out, nasty war with the British for independence, and had a very disunited and chaotic state that had to be somehow unified one way or another. And eventually, the United States found a way, and that's sort of the position that other people in the world face themselves. At any rate, often they speak of it this way. They see the United States as some kind of a, how to put it, some kind of a not a model, but some sort of an analogy, some kind of a conception of how a state might be put together. You see the same thing today with the European Union. People are talking about a Hamiltonian moment in the European Union, which is going to allow the European Union to emerge as a European superstate, start issuing its own bonds, and all the rest of that. So you see that kind of tendency of thought, and it's very strong with regard to these African states. So it centers on Patrice Lumumba in the Congo, and the partition of the Congo had to do with the desire to preserve some of the mineral wealth in the Congo. So in the bottom part of the map of the Congo that you see before, you see the province of Katanga, the biggest province there. Nowadays they call it Shaba province. Katanga, that is the center of the mineral wealth of the Congo, but you have to put it more strongly than that. It's the center of the mineral wealth of Africa, if you can imagine that. So uranium, gold, diamonds, all sorts of things, all sorts of raw materials to be found in the western and southern parts of the Congo. The area around Goma, as you see on this map nowadays, very important for precious metals. And the area of Katanga in those days, in 1960. And the Belgians found a way to set up another Belgian politician there who's going to be more friendly to Belgian interests. And his name was Moise Tshombe. So Tshombe was a kind of an anti-Lumumba, right, from the beginning. He was going to be more friendly to the Belgians and more friendly to their mining interests, most of which centered around a gigantic firm, the Union Minière du Haut-Katanga, the firm which later changed its name 2 or 3 times, and which still exists today. So Tshombe was going to be the, how to put it, the Belgian candidate in the Congo, and the vehicle of a Katangese separatism, a separate Katangese state, no doubt much more friendly to the much more valuable and much more friendly to the Belgians as the Belgians departed. The same problem holds for a person like Chumbe. They're going to look around to see who's going to give them weapons, who's going to support them. And so the Belgians were going to help, but also a lot of mercs were available to help out Chumbe and his gendarmes to set up a regime. It's not that he had a real army to speak of, but he did have some forces at his command. Turns out they were only useful for use against Lumumba, not against anything else, and that's all they had to be. So there you have the whole question of the Chumbe and the Katangi's separatism. And that resulted in 1960 in the arrest of Lumumba under rather mysterious circumstances, which we're just finding out more about today, in which intelligence agencies were involved, especially the American ones, and in which Lumumba ended up getting arrested and turned over to Chumbe, and Chumbe carried out the execution of Lumumba. Apparently all an operation that was planned outside the country, and we're now told, we're getting revelations about this all the time in our media, we're now told that it's pretty much the strings were pulled by the Eisenhower administration in the United States. So that was one thing. Eisenhower left John F. Kennedy as he left office, as Kennedy was elected in 1960, the murder of Lumumba and the breaking off of relations with Cuba. All problems that Kennedy had to sort out had to live with after Eisenhower was gone. The African politicians made common cause with other politicians when the Cubans made their revolution, about which we'll speak in a minute. They had all kinds of contacts with these African independence-minded politicians. So here you see Che Guevara with Kwame Nkrumah, very friendly relations. And by the way, I'm mentioning most of this stuff, not just to give an indication of who met with whom on the level of personalities, but to give you an indication of what was coming before the media, especially in the United States, especially among black people in the United States, what was being presented to them about some of these new leaders in the world, and that the leaders of the Cuban Revolution, which by this time was understood to be a communist dictatorship of the proletariat, that relations between them and between various African independence leaders could be very friendly, very warm. So this was presented in the United States. Now, some people will be horrified by this. Some people will be elated by this. Some people will change their whole perceptions. Imagine students now starting to think of the world in these terms rather than the old-fashioned colonial way of looking at the world. So that's the reason I pay some attention to these things. There's Nkrumah of Ghana with Julius Nyerere, another popular, charismatic, socialist-minded leader from Tanzania. So this Pan-African idea has that kind of connection to it. And there's Nkrumah in African garb, meeting with Mao Zedong, so presumably Chinese communists. It's the Bandung spirit. It's a united third world. There's Mao with Sékou Touré. So all these personalities well known in the United States, well known to American black people. And there's a very well known person to American black people, Muhammad Ali, the great heavyweight, one of the greatest heavyweights of all time, maybe the greatest heavyweight, some say, although there's argumentation about that. But at any rate, a great fighter. And there he is in similar African garb in his dashiki, visiting Kwame Nkrumah. And Martin Luther King was on good speaking terms with Kwame Nkrumah and professed himself openly to be very inspired by the African independence movements, and especially by people like Nkrumah and all the things that they were able to achieve. So a whole series of role models started to come up before black students in the United States when they started to think about politics. And they no longer thought about Africa as the dark continent. That's all they'd ever seen in movies, you know. And they started to think maybe there's more to Africa than this kind of colonial imagery that we've been subjected to in our literature and culture. And maybe there are real leaders there, real national leaders, and maybe we can have something like that here. Maybe the black people in the United States ought to be inspired, ought to seek inspiration. This is definitely something you could see developing among black students in about 1960, 1961. And Martin Luther King, of course, was leading his own independence movement from the time of the Montgomery bus boycott, as you probably already know from your other courses in American history. So he's not at all dependent on any of these African politicians for any kind of support, but he's a leader in his own right. All right, so those things were all shaping up, and I would make the argument that the struggle against Jim Crow, which started to break out in earnest in the United States, that is to say outside the South of the United States in 1960, owes a lot to this, how to put it, this movement of the zeitgeist, this spillover effect, this sense of the atmosphere of third world liberationism and African nationalism and all the rest of that, in addition to the outbreak of revolution in Latin America with the Cuban Revolution in 1959. So you know that after the overthrow of the Guatemalan regime in 1954, that there were leftists and communists who had participated and held some hopes in the, how to put it, social democratic path, very moderate and liberal path of revolutionism in Latin America. We're very disappointed to see that crushed by the coup against the Arbenz regime in Guatemala in 1954. One of them was Che Guevara, and they decided to go further to the left and to go into guerrilla warfare to take by arms what they had previously thought, and what certainly communists who paid any attention to Moscow preached to all of their followers, that instead of the parliamentary road. So Moscow never gave advice to people to fight in the woods, that sort of thing. No, they always told these communist parties to take a parliamentary path. And in nearly every case in Latin America, whenever you do see African guerrillas carrying out communist or nationalist programs by means of guerrilla war on the countryside, the communist parties most closely associated with them, or other communist parties in Latin America, will take a dim view of this. Tactically, they'll think it's adventurism. They don't want to go this far. It's ultra radical stuff. It reminds them of Trotsky and all notions of leftism that were put behind when Trotsky and his followers were expelled from the Soviet Union. They always advised the parliamentary path. This was the case with the Communist Party of Cuba, the Socialist Party, called Popular Socialist Party of Cuba, was what they called the Communist Party, and most of its major leaders, Blas Roca, Carlos Rafael Rodriguez, and others, they took a dim view of the Castro movement, criticized it, thought it was adventurous and ultra-left and all the rest of that. So just about the whole time that Castro was in the woods, in the Sierra Maestra, fighting against the Batista regime, he was under very serious criticism on the part of the communists. There was a certain bitterness. In fact, I wouldn't say, I should put it more strongly, considerable bitterness on the part of the Cuban leaders, including Castro, about the way they had been criticized by the Cuban communists. At the very end of the thing, though, when it looked like they were winning, the communists pitched in and helped them a lot, and helped them with a city movement that combined with what they had done in the mountains. So that when Batista fled on New Year's Day, 1959, there was a big city movement that greeted the 26th of July movement led by Fidel Castro, people who'd landed in the mountains several years earlier on the little Grandma, a little boat you can take a look at when you visit Havana. There's a museum and they have the whole boat there. And they had just a handful of their followers who made an attempt to land on the island in 1956, and it was repelled. But at any rate, they finally won. They finally come to power. And in the United States, there develops a tremendous discussion what to make of all this. There was enormous sympathy, I have to say, throughout the American media. The New York Times, for example, toward the Castro movement. One of its reporters, Herbert Matthews, had gone to visit Castro. He is convinced Castro was not at all dangerous to the United States. In fact, kind of friendly to the United States, admired the United States, admired Abraham Lincoln and the whole traditions of American progressive thought and politics. And that he was really nothing more than an agrarian reformer, as they'd once said about Mao Zedong. It's probably true. Not exactly a reformer, but certainly a revolutionary, but I don't think he had anything more than democratic ideas. At any rate, his program was not of that sort. Prior to coming to power, Castro made the argument that all he intended to do was to restore the Constitution of 1940. That the Batista regime was a dictatorship, it was an enemy of democracy, has to be overthrown in favor of this broadly democratic regime. And there were a lot of his followers who were not communists, not socialists, maybe not even really progressives, strictly speaking, but who just, how to put it, moderate people who admired democracy and did not like dictatorship. And they all rallied. You know, all revolutions have to rally across the spectrum. People who think the way they do and people who don't. They all rallied around Castro. So then the whole question was, how do we understand all of this stuff in the United States, in Britain, in Europe? How do Western intellectuals who are trying to process all this stuff, and of course the black intellectuals in the United States, that's very important because they have a huge movement that is going to be boiling right up at about the same time that all these things are happening. How should they interpret the Cuban Revolution? So there's huge literature on this. I could recommend to you a number of books. Robert Scheer and Maurice Zeitlin wrote a book called Cuba, Tragedy in Our Hemisphere. Their argument was Castro was a Democrat. He would have been friendly to the United States, but the United States acted against him too sternly because Castro started to nationalize some very small amounts of Cuban property. True enough, in 1959, when they came to power, they passed the Agrarian Reform Law. They nationalized some ranches, some sugar refineries, some oil refineries owned by the Americans, maybe $800 million worth, not a gigantic sum, really, when you think about the scale of this. That was the property they wanted to nationalize. They thought it was their prerogative. And the United States ought to consider that part of the revolution that it had to accept. They were revolutionaries after all. But it didn't. The United States did not. Immediately started to take actions against Castro. And these actions led step by step to a series of moves by which Castro broke entirely with the United States and turned to the communists and himself became a communist. So the Cuban sugar quota was threatened at first. Then the United States, under Eisenhower, before Eisenhower left office, cut off the Cuban sugar quota. It had to do with the chain events with some oil refineries that were nationalized by Castro and the United States striking back by cutting the sugar quota. And cutting the sugar quota is such a final kind of act. I mean, it means, at least in economic terms, that Cuba is going to be the enemy from this point on. There's no reconciliation possible from this point. Cuba is pretty much a one-crop economy. It sells it all to the United States. So it was such an extreme measure that the Eisenhower administration took when it handed over this problem to Jack Kennedy in 1960, that it really did not make possible any kind of action short of um, very bitter opposition between the United States and the Cuban Revolution. But Scheer and Maurice Zeitlin, Bob Scheer and Maurice Zeitlin, in their book, they made the argument that this didn't need to happen. The United States could have got along, and of course that's right. Of course that's right. The United States, if it had decided that these nationalizations didn't count for much, it didn't need to drive Cuba into the hands of the Soviets as a result of this. So they call their book The Tragedy in Our Hemisphere, meaning a tragedy for American foreign policy. Maybe they didn't mean a tragedy for the human race. That's the continuing argument about the Cuban Revolution. Was it a good thing or a bad or whatever? But at any rate, all of this pretty much accomplished by the time Eisenhower left office and handed over to John Kennedy. There was another book beside in the ocean of literature. Jean-Paul Sartre wrote about it, visited Cuba, was very favorable to the Cuban Revolution. Ernest Hemingway, he liked Castro, had himself photographed with Castro, very favorable to the Castro Revolution and all the rest of that. But a book by Theodore Draper about Cuban communism, Myths and Realities, made out a case for social democrats of the Michael Harrington type, who I mentioned last time, talking about Khrushchev's secret speech. Michael Harrington. Socialists and social democrats of that sort were appealed to by Theodore Draper's argument to be very hostile to Castro. Say he's an enemy of democracy, he's a friend of the Soviets. The Cuban Revolution does not need to be so radical. The Cuban labor movement was very sophisticated. Cubans had a higher standard of living than a lot of Latin American countries, and they did not need the Castro Revolution, argued Theodore Draper. Very cogent argument by a historian of American communism, and that was read widely. There was a great deal of sentiment in the United States among leftists, progressives, social democrats of various sorts that was hostile to Castro, at least for a while. And this kind of thing lay behind support for the attempt to overthrow Castro in April 1961 at the Bay of Pigs. Castro organized Cuban society from top to bottom and carried out all sorts of things that were enormously attractive to people in the United States, especially young people in the United States. Here's a woman's brigade with all of them marching very smartly, and there are the major leaders of the revolution, and they're all marching very, very smartly. Not all of them in their guerrilla garb. The one who's not is Osvaldo Dorticos, who they made the president, really a figurehead. The 26th of July movement was going to be the leadership of the country. But of course, a movement that is basically a guerrilla movement doesn't have all of the intellectuals, doesn't have all of the, how to put it, all the educated people that it takes to run a society once you're in power. And they found more and more that they needed the communists for this. And that the communists really had the more sophisticated conceptions of how to run a country administratively. So that the old fighters in the 26th of July movement found themselves eclipsed to some degree by the communists, who ended up taking positions in the various administrative parts of the Cuban economy afterward, and the Cuban administration generally. So, and then a lot of these old 26th of July comrades of Castro had been in the mountains with him for years, didn't take kindly to this. So a number of them started to quarrel bitterly about the rise of the importance of the communists. Castro kind of wavered for a while, then he decided he had to come down on the side of integration with the communists. That's an interesting question why he made this decision. Was it because he was thinking about getting Soviet help at some point? Did he just need them intellectually? Did their arguments convince him? Was it a question of his brother, Raul, being a longtime communist, a person like Che Guevara being a longtime communist? I don't think Castro, at any rate, he certainly didn't talk that way, that he was a communist. And it wasn't just a question of a subterfuge, of a how to put it, a con game that he was attempting with the United States. I think it was sincere that he said, oh, we're worried about the tyranny represented by the Soviets to the same degree as the tyranny represented by Yankee imperialism. Okay. So he did talk that way. And eventually he had to make a decision about all of this. He ended up siding with the communists. So people like Hubert Matos fell afoul of the administration. He got thrown in the clink. He did 20 years for opposing, and this is mainly opposing the integration with the communist movement that took place in the fall of 1959. And there were others, David Salvador, Faustino Perez, I was going to say Blas Roca. No, he was a communist. So there are other 26th of July movement members who ended up forced to break with Castro over this question of the communists. And then the opposite occurred. In 1962, it looked as if there was a communist, Aníbal Escalante, the head of the Communist Party, who looked as if he was going to emerge as the leader of the country, and Castro was just going to be perhaps some kind of figurehead or some kind of colorful figure from the early days of the revolution. So there was a real squawk about that, and Castro ended up having to turn against him, against Escalante in 1962. From that point on, the Soviets had to accept him. We have something comparable to this in the Chinese Revolution. There was a man named Gao Gong. You'll remember him from when we were talking about the Chinese Civil War. He was a very close associate of Mao Zedong and in Manchuria, governor of Manchuria for the communists. But he was too close to the Soviets, and in the end, he got removed from power. Mao, in the end, would not tolerate that. Mao was not just going to be, not going to get to run his own country, not going to allow a communist official loyal to Moscow to eclipse him. That issue is going to be magnified as we proceed through the 60s in relations between the Chinese and the Russians. And it shows up in Cuba, too, in the Escalante affair. Aníbal Escalante, in this analogy, equals Gao Gong vis-a-vis Mao Zedong. Escalante vis-a-vis Castro equals Gao Gong vis-a-vis Mao Zedong. At any rate, the Cuban movement, of course, going through its transformations and inter-party struggles, all the rest of that. Castro, the most fabulous, charismatic, revolutionary leader that Latin American radicalism has ever seen, and deciding by about 1960 or so, I think even before the Bay of Pigs in 1961, that he was a Marxist-Leninist, and that he thought Cuba ought to make common cause with the Soviet bloc against Western imperialism. And he carried out all sorts of transformations inside Cuba. Cuban exiles in the United States treated Castro, and they still do, well, some of them still do, as nothing but the devil himself, a reincarnation of Hitler or something like that. But many in the United States were very, very impressed by progressive aspects of the regime. And when you visit Cuba, you have to go to the Museum of the Literacy Campaign. They have this special little museum outside of Havana. And there they show you the pictures of all these youth that came out of the high schools and colleges and formed these battalions and marched down to the countryside among the illiterate peasantry and taught them how to read and write. They have walls in the museum that are covered with these little letters from the grateful peasants saying how much their lives were changed when they learned how to read and write. It's quite a thing. It's very awe-inspiring, and etc. And then it had its effect outside of Cuba. So while some emigres from the regime who lost out lost out in the thing, maybe 200,000 of them all told, who lost property one way or another when the regime turned into a dictatorship of the proletariat. Well, they naturally will maintain their enmity down through the generations. There were also an awful lot of people who took the view that these are changes the Cubans want, and this is a Cuban affair, and not all of it is so wicked as one can imagine. Things like the literacy campaign as a case in point. Nevertheless, in the United States, after the sugar quota went by the board, and that was Eisenhower's doing, and the Cubans started to fish around, as they did in the middle of 1960, for a trade agreement with the Soviets, ended up with the arrangement that the Soviets would accept their sugar and give them oil in return. So that's a big bargain there, big transformation. And a lot of people made the argument that the United States didn't have to. I'm one of the people who thinks the United States did not have to force that. Did not, and if it really thought it in its interest to keep the Soviets from linking up with the Castro regime, it certainly could have been more friendly, especially on these trade matters, all important trade matters. Cuba has a one-crop economy. But at any rate, that's the way it worked out, and the Soviets developed this trade relationship. They sent Anastas Mikoyan there in 1960. They signed a big trade agreement, Soviets to take Cuban sugar, and Cubans get Soviet oil as a result of this. The United States, by this time, was planning an invasion of Cuba, invasion that was going to be mounted in Central America and was going to land at a place that was pretty close to Havana, but far enough from Havana that it would be difficult to get troops from right around Havana and the garrison, get them to get to this spot, this beach, this Bay of Pigs, and if this landing didn't come off, the last instructions that the people who were landing were given was they were to melt away into the mountains and be like Castro, take up a Castro-like struggle against Castro. So who were these people? So very small in number, right? Just several hundred people. But they're mostly, I shouldn't say mostly, but they're very prominent among them were people who were congenial to the American left. At any rate, the social democratic Michael Harrington type of American left that we were talking about before. So a number of these people took the view, people who read Theodore Draper, they took the view that these people would restore democracy and maybe kick the Soviets out and et cetera. It'd be a wholesome leftist cause. But it wasn't very secret. Castro got wind of it. In fact, there was a journal in the United States, a Latin American report published at Stanford by a guy named Ronald Hilton, who told all about the plans for the affair even before it was mounted. So it was not a secret. And Castro got wind of it and got enough troops onto the spot and put it down with force. So this is a kind of a great thing for shoring up Castro's credentials with the left in Cuba. As a leader of the country, and now the leader of the country is up against the United States, the biggest power in the world, and really it puts down this rebellion at the Bay of Pigs. So this is a great moment for Castro. There he is conferring with Che Guevara about strategy at the Bay of Pigs. Eventually they ended up defeating it and taking off most of the guerrillas as ones who had not been killed by Castro's artillery, taking them off as prisoners. And they still celebrate that thing. So here it is, fatherland or death, as it was at Giron, the Bay of Pigs, Giron, as it was at the Bay of Pigs. So that will stick in their mind. And that tank over there, that's a Soviet tank, T-34. Cubans don't make tanks. They have to get them from Russia. So Russia's sending these old World War II T-34s, a great tank in World War II. They're sending them all over the world. You're going to see them in Angola. We'll talk about that when we get there. The United States looks terrible. Of course, extremely embarrassing to send 1,400 men to to overthrow a country and then have them defeated on the beach without even being able to make a landing. And then, of course, there was the idea that maybe the landing was only a trigger, and if these people were defeated, that maybe the U.S. armed forces were going to pile into it and invade Cuba. It's pretty clear now that the military in the United States was kicking these thoughts around at the time and resented very much Jack Kennedy's refusal to go any further with the thing and a limited, how to put it, limited operation on the scale of Guatemala in '54 or the scale of Iran. That's really all Kennedy was willing to put behind this. Not that he didn't hate Castro, not that he wasn't an anti-communist, not that he didn't want to be a greater and more successful anti-communist than Eisenhower had been. That is to say, more stern about anti-communism than Dulles and Eisenhower had been in the 50s, but that he did not want to take it to the point of using U.S. troops and invading Cuba. So it turned out to be a horrible fiasco, terrific embarrassment. Kennedy looked horrible, and his restraint, by the way, didn't help him at all with the Latin American press. And so here you have a cartoon by a Latin American cartoonist describing the new president. He's got the same collar as the new dog, the new president, and it's a dog with the same collar, but it's a different dog. So that is to say, the Nazi and capitalist, how to put it, axis represented by U.S. imperialism now has a new vehicle in Jack Kennedy, but it's still the same, pretty much the same cause. So Kennedy looked bad to the people on his right, looked bad to the people on his left. There's a Cuban cartoon translated for us. Remember the Bay of Pigs, you know, and there are the Cuban revolutionaries being given the finger, so to speak, being dismissed in a humiliating way from the island. So big embarrassment, and maybe a big embarrassment generally among Kennedy's supporters. Some thought that maybe Kennedy came off looking very bad as a result of the Bay of Pigs. Well, certainly among those who wanted to see him invade Cuba, but among those who were rather more, what's the word, friendly toward Cuba, toward the Cuban Revolution, or at any rate, who didn't want to make such a big affair of it. Maybe people who would normally have been friends of the Kennedy administration, Kennedy supporters on the left, liberal left, I guess you'd have to say, they were kind of disillusioned by the thing too, as this cartoon is trying to indicate. Hollywood didn't mind it though. It was lots of fun, and they made a film with Errol Flynn. He got to star with one of his latest girlfriends, one of the girlfriends he was with at the end of his life, the 15-year-old Beverly Atland, in a film about Cuban rebel girls. Very exciting stuff for Errol Flynn fans. Afterward, though, Castro and Khrushchev, Soviet Union and Cuba, fellow communists, now breathing the same air, now linked in solidarity. Khrushchev said that he and the other members of the Soviet Politburo regained their youth, he said in his memoirs. They regained their youth when the Castro administration became their ally. I should say the Castro's revolution became their ally. And that's certainly the way it looked to the Western press, that Khrushchev was cooking up revolution all over the world, in Laos Algeria, in the Congo. They blamed the Soviets for everything. And this is overheated, if that metaphor, if that word works for this, describing this cartoon. And this is a little bit steamy language to describe the thing. The long hand of Moscow and all the rest of that. But to some extent, that's not wrong. That the Soviets really did want to see a revolution in the world. They did want to impress Mao, that they were genuine revolutionaries. Mao wanted to egg them on as much as possible, and giving aid and comfort to class and liberation struggles, as Khrushchev put it. Giving aid and comfort to those was really central to the whole enterprise. And this applied even to the confrontation with the United States in Berlin, which got very warm in the summer of 1961. There's a European cartoon with Khrushchev threatening the whole globe and threatening world peace. Even the liberal in the United States, Herblock, takes the view that Khrushchev's a really evil character threatening world peace with all of his mischief all over the world. So even liberals made this argument. Kennedy met with Khrushchev at Vienna in the summer of '61 and just tried to discuss all these things, see if they could come to some kind of détente-ish business-like relationship regarding these affairs. And Khrushchev absolutely drubbed him, denounced him up and down, told him class and liberation struggles are a sacred duty of the Soviet Union. So Khrushchev, acting like a real revolutionary, who's going to overthrow everybody in the world, and telling Kennedy that he should not be on the wrong side of history. And if he did choose to be on the wrong side of history, well, tough. And Kennedy came away from that. And he remarked that if Khrushchev is going to stay in this mood, it's going to be a long winter. This is very tough stuff. It was understood in Europe as a bitter struggle over the whole world, basically, over revolutionary issues all over the world, and with nuclear weapons in the hip pockets of the two leading contestants, ready to be used in a confrontation that could be World War III. And in this, a lot of European opinion took the view that Kennedy really doesn't know what the deuce he's doing, that he's in with a very sophisticated person, Khrushchev, backed by a equally sophisticated and sinister figure in Mao, and that these diplomats who are seasoned and who have experience and who are, at any rate, a lot older than Kennedy. There you see Harold Macmillan, Charles de Gaulle, Konrad Adenauer standing behind Kennedy, and he's sitting on a book, Chess in 100 Days. He's a novice, an amateur, and he's trying to deal with some formidable opponents, and it's an uneven struggle. So they didn't think much of Kennedy, in short. This cartoon, I thought, and by the way, I think that's all wet, but this cartoon, I thought, did describe a genuine reality. Khrushchev was trying to do two things at once. He was trying to maintain the leadership of the communist world by means of nuclear diplomacy against the West, with the idea of gaining several marches against the West and dealing blows to the West. So I'm trying to do both things, trying to satisfy Mao and trying to fight against the West. So Khrushchev maybe was biting off way more than he could chew, especially when he raised the Berlin issue at the end of '61. So we have two Berlin crises, one in '58, one in '61. This is the biggest one, in which Khrushchev said that if they couldn't get a separate arrangement on the relationship and access routes to Berlin, and the relationship of Berlin to the rest of East Germany, they couldn't get a deal with the West on this. They were simply going to turn over, the Soviets, were simply going to turn over um, their garrison in East Germany to the East German government. So the Western powers didn't even recognize East German government. They thought they got these access routes. You see them here, 3 air routes. There's a road, autobahn, and a railroad and a canal route that goes directly to Germany, right in the center, and 3 air routes. So these are all negotiated directly with the Soviets, and East Germany doesn't play any role in them, presumably, at least in the mind. It's kind of a fiction, but it's in the mind of the Western diplomats. They don't want to even recognize East Germany, and more than that, they want to break relations with anybody. The Holstein Doctrine, it's called. Break relations with anybody who does recognize East Germany. So they're going to drop all this by 1975, but at the time they were pretty adamant about all these things and did not want to give up these. There's no treaty that lays down these rights, but did not want to give up these rights that were laid out just by convention in 1945. So Khrushchev was pushing them to the brink. And inside Berlin, the access to the different zones through the checkpoints now came to be a very difficult issue. And lots of weapons were brought up to face off. Here you see the tanks that I had in my unit. I was a platoon leader with 5 of these things. These are the M48s they had with a 90 millimeter gun. Big thing, 52 tons. These are the tanks that were brought up to these checkpoints. They were facing off at the Soviet tanks. You see in the background, these are the Soviet tanks, T-55s, and their gun tubes are pointed directly at the Americans. American gun tubes are pointed directly at the Soviets. Gee, that's, we don't want to have that. That was an atmosphere of tension that was developed over this Berlin crisis. And in the course of it, the East Germans decided, the Soviets decided really, to build a wall right through the middle of Berlin and make it impossible for citizens to go back and forth between the zones, to go to work in the West Zone, come home to live in the East Zone. So people in the East Zone had to stay in the East Zone after this point, after the wall went up. There's another look at the tank, kind of looking very attractive there, isn't it? Perhaps I should tell you something about the armament. Oh, I don't know if I should bother. Anyhow, it's a 90 millimeter gun and a 50 caliber thing out of the commander's cupola up on the top. And it has a coaxial 30 caliber machine gun mounted. It shoots anywhere the main gun goes. As the turret turns, you fire a 30 caliber. And there's the driver right under the gun. Watch out when you traverse the gun that you don't hit him on the top of his helmet, as I almost did one time. But at any rate, that's the weaponry. And Khrushchev was presented to the world as, this picture says it all, as the guy who's going to start World War III over access to Berlin, or something like that. Her bloc agrees. Khrushchev is getting ready to blow up the entire world. Well, he backed down over that at the end of 1961. Jack Kennedy stood up, said, call up the reserves, we're ready to stop you. So Khrushchev had to back off on that issue. And he was smarting from that, no doubt, because he raised the same issue just about in October of 1962 over Cuba by getting the Cuban government, Castro's, permission to bring intermediate range ballistic missiles and station them in Cuba. So that would have given Castro essentially the same ability to attack the Soviet Union that the United States had in its IRBM strategy when it placed Thors and Jupiters, as we were already saying last time, in England and in Italy and Turkey. And of course, Matadors on Taiwan. So this would have given the Soviets the same kind of capability, which they didn't have up to this point. So it's a big step forward in the arms race in terms of threats to the United States. It's a much more specific and articulate threat and a very direct threat to U.S. cities. Now, many made the argument, many liberals in the United States made the argument that this wouldn't change things at all. Soviets could hit the United States, could have an intercontinental ballistic missile, but they didn't have very many of them at the time. And they had plenty of these weapons, IRBMs, as did the United States. So if they put a lot of these things into Cuba, it definitely changes the calculus, changes the balance threat. And psychologically, and of course a lot of this is psychological, it gives the Cubans an enormous, how to put it, enormous threat, enormous psychological imposition, psychological threat against the United States. Kennedy didn't exactly know what to do about it. And finally, he came to the view that we have to impose a blockade around it. Now, there were others who said this is our chance to invade the island. But he didn't want that. He didn't want a big struggle to overcome the Cuban Revolution with force. And he was thinking about all of Latin America and how just that's too blatant, too much. He did not want to be, how to put it, an extreme, a man of the extreme right, a militarist, and etc. Of course, the military men, Curtis LeMay for the Air Force, Army men too, Lyman Lemnitzer for the Army, many of them took the view that it's a great opportunity for us to invade. If they'd done that, though, some of these weapons might have been used. You know, the launch on warning, this would be launch under attack, launch during invasion. Some of them might have been used. Who knows how this whole thing might have turned. And of course, people did not know one way or another whether Castro was going to make this decision or not. It's pretty sure now that if Castro had really had control over all these weapons and the United States invaded the island, that he certainly would not have shrunk from use of these weapons, as he said afterward, use of these weapons against the United States. So that was a tremendous thought that Kennedy was presented with, the idea of invading the island. Kennedy said, no. Moreover, suppose we do raise hell with Cuba, they're in a position to do the same thing to us in Berlin. Suppose they counter in Berlin. So we got two of these things going on at the same time. And by the way, both these things could very easily and maybe necessarily end in nuclear war. So he said, no, cannot do this. As a matter of fact, I have to work out a relationship with Khrushchev out of this. I've got to defeat him. I've got to change him from what I saw in Vienna. He's got to learn defeat. And then I've got to be so magnanimous in victory that we'll negotiate a deal over all this that will include Berlin too. It'll be across the board. It'll have linkage, as Kissinger later on would put this kind of thing. It'll be a deal across the board. It'll be a generalized détente. It'll be a solution to the whole Cold War. Well, that's what Kennedy had in mind. And his handling of this thing could hardly be faulted. I know there are some people who fault it on both sides of the equation. Critics of Kennedy from the left or from the right, they fault him for different reasons. Graham Allison, who wrote a book, The Essence of Decision, laid out all the details of the thing, and that is the analysis that everybody has pretty much followed. I mean, I don't think you could improve on this analysis of the thing, that this thing was handled about as well as it could possibly have been handled, with enormous finesse. Jack Kennedy was quite brilliant. He was at his most brilliant. This is the kind of thing he really understood better than almost anything else. So that turned out exactly that way. And it turned out with a deal, too. It turned out with a deal. Maybe I'll talk a little bit more about that next time as we're kind of exhausting our mandate here. Talk a little bit more about Khrushchev's decision when we talk about the decision to get rid of him on account of this adventure that his colleagues in the Kremlin made in 1964. But at any rate, the two of them, the Soviets and the United States, had come to the brink. So we have to say in our course that we're going to run across a lot of tension in Soviet-American relations, but there will never be a moment like this again. This is the closest the world ever came, ever, to nuclear war. But Kennedy had it figured out. The Soviets have no navy. You put a blockade around Cuba, the Soviets have to break through the blockade with force. They have nothing to use in that way. They're stuck. The only thing they can do is make nuclear war against the United States. The United States in good shape as for a nuclear war, if it is possible. God forbid, if it is possible to be in good shape for a nuclear war. So the Soviets are doubly deterred, one would say. They had to back down. By the way, I think this was the case from the minute that the blockade was declared. The logic of it was, it's an adventure, you didn't get away with it, Nikita. You didn't get away with it. You've got to back down now. Of course, he didn't want to do it right away. He wanted to bargain, get something for it. And Kennedy was willing to give him things. In fact, Kennedy maybe gave him about as much as you could possibly ask for. He promised him, although he said he wouldn't admit it in public, but he promised him that eventually the Thors and Jupiters, the IRBMs, would be taken out. Since then, everybody has said, oh, these missiles are obsolete. Well, obsolete. Obsolete meaning the United States was wanted to rely on missiles in the Minuteman series. We'll talk more about this later. That could be fired from the United States. It didn't want to put missiles of this sort up against the Soviet border like that. So they were kind of an obstacle. In that way, you could say they're obsolete in terms of American strategy. But they certainly were quite functional and could have carried out their mission, their military mission, without any difficulty. So he gave them that. And he gave them a promise he wouldn't invade Cuba. Castro could make the argument, although he couldn't get away with this argument, but he could have tried to protest that, hey, I came away from this with quite a bit. I did rather well by this whole thing. But he couldn't make that argument because it was all forced on him. All forced on him. He had to back down. Kennedy is a winner. Khrushchev is a loser. Interesting. The psychology of confrontation among great states. The notion of winning and losing. So Kennedy is the great man of the hour. David Levine's cartoon for the New York Review of Books. He's astride two horses running in opposite directions. You can't beat that. He is the most brilliant man in the world. He is the lawgiver unto the earth. And all those diplomats of other countries who previously had wondered if he was just a kid who couldn't handle a man's job have got a tremendous lesson. He is a great, great statesman, leader. He beats them all. There they are, all in this cartoon. They're all looking up to Kennedy. People who have been through World War II are looking up to Jack Kennedy. He's come through the whole thing. And moreover, he made clear that he wanted this to mean an era of détente and an end, really, to the Cold War at its worst. It's questionable whether you can actually think about ending the whole Cold War. But at American University, in the summer of 1963, he said that we can help make the world safe for diversity. So Woodrow Wilson's slogan in World War I was, make the world safe for democracy. Make the world safe for diversity, meaning for communism. So the United States is no longer going to take the view that it's got to fight to the death against communism. There are going to be different kinds of systems in the world. We have to understand the Russians. We have to understand revolution. There's revolution all over the world. We can't be having nuclear wars just because the world happens to be revolutionary. We cannot make the world over, make everything change, change the hands of the clock just because we have nuclear weapons. No. And that's what Kennedy offered the world at this time. Vis-a-vis the Vietnam situation, there's an analogy there. He's thinking about reducing America's commitment there too. Tremendous victories for John Kennedy. But in another year, both he, the victor, and Khrushchev, the defeated, are going to be removed from power against their will. Both of them. And the whole world's going to go back to the Cold War in its own nasty way. This great, great victory. This great moment for the human race is not going to have its proper sequel. Well, we have to record that and its history as we proceed. So perhaps this is the moment for us to break off our meeting. Next time we'll continue with more on Jack Kennedy and his policy in the United States.